So I want to welcome everyone to this second in a series of 3 webinars this fall from the Gathering Place, where faith formation leaders gather, learn, share, and grow. My name is Shanna Peachy Bushhart. I'm the Formation Minister for Mennonite Church USA. And we gather here as disciples of Jesus. And as Jesus' disciples, it is our desire to be transformed into his likeness. Being transformed into Jesus' likeness means that we are going to change. And we're going to need to be open to change. It means that we'll always need to be open to changing our minds as we discern God's will together. We are exhorted in Romans, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I was reminded this past Sunday in church that we don't need to think alike, but we do need to think together. So, in that spirit, we come together to learn together, to be transformed into Christ-likeness, and to think together, so that we may discern the will of God more perfectly. Before we get started, I want to go over a few logistical details. I noticed that you're doing very well with keeping your microphones muted. That is a very good practice. It keeps us all, especially the more people we have on our webinar, the more it helps us all to keep our focus on the person who's talking. It's also really helpful if you ever have a problem with like an uneven connection, it can help you to keep your camera off. And again, I set it up so that the cameras were off as you entered. I find that it's just less distracting for all of us if the cameras are off, but you certainly have the option of turning it on if you like. This is the second in a series of 3 webinars. The recording of the first webinar has been posted at thegatheringplace.us. And I just would politely ask that if you didn't join us for that first webinar or watch the first video, please honor those who have done so by limiting your questions and comments in this webinar to the topics at hand, the topics that Scott is covering this evening. Scott is really good about answering whatever questions you have and engaging you through email outside the webinar. And I believe I'm not speaking out of turn when I say that he'd be happy to answer an email from you should you want to send him an email with a specific question that was more pertinent to last month's topic. So now I'd like to introduce Michael Danner. Michael is the Associate Executive Director for Church Vitality for Mennonite Church USA. He was a longtime pastor, served as conference minister in Illinois Conference before joining our executive board staff in 2018. And he will continue to host the webinar and introduce Scott.
Yeah, good evening. It's good to be with everyone once again. This is a pretty timely topic. As I told Scott earlier, I'm sitting in my dining room, but I can hear the debate for the Democratic primary going on in the other room in our house. And it's almost to the point where if you wanted to get away from politics in American life, you'd be hard pressed to do so at this point. And so I really appreciate Scott's willingness to engage at this intersection of what it means to be an Anabaptist Christian today and how does that impact the way that we engage in politics. Got off to a great start in the first week, which Scott's going to recap about crossing the partisan divide. And then today getting into the role of government. What is the role and function of government and how does that shape the way we engage that? So if you don't know Scott Peterson is our presenter. He is the leadership pastor at Trinity Mennonite Church in Phoenix, Arizona, where he's been on staff there for 6 years. Is that correct? 5 years. I've got him ahead a year, but he's doing really well, so it feels like 6. Yeah, throughout as Scott leads and teaches, please ask questions as you go. Use the chat feature on the right, and he'll do an excellent job of stopping periodically to answer questions. I'll curate those questions and ask Scott at those times. So without further introduction, here's Scott Peterson. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks, Michael. And Shanna, I am excited to be talking about this subject with you all again. This is a topic that comes up regularly now in my daily life after having presented it here at Trinity and then at the convention, at the denominational convention. I get consistent emails and even just the congregation here at Trinity regularly asks me about this topic. So it's really exciting to be opening it up to a larger group of people to allow for better communication around this issue. For the most part, well, you know it. I don't have to remind you that our culture right now doesn't seem to know how to talk about politics in a way that doesn't get to a level of, well, almost hatred, or at bare minimum, internal anxiety that removes from us the ability to converse in productive ways. So being able to be a church that says we are something else and the image we give to the world is something else, even when we talk about politics, is more important now than ever. I do want to encourage you to type in questions when you have them in the chat area. Any question at all that comes to your mind during this time, Michael's going to be working on vetting those as we go forward at the question times. But it's going to be very important that any question you have, it's likely someone else has as well. So you might as well throw it out there, and we may get to it later. And if we do, I'll make sure to let you know, hey, we're going to get there, and I'll just hold off on that. But if not, we want to make sure we cover it so that everyone's on the same page as we go forward through this. I want to start by, first off, in a conversation like this, I'm reminded regularly about the need for the power of God's Spirit among us. So I want to start us off with a quick prayer. God, thank you for these people who have committed themselves to the work of reconciliation, even in the political realm, in their churches and in their communities. May they be strengthened by your Spirit in their conversations, to speak with conviction and humility in a way that shows the uniqueness of your church in a fallen world. We offer you this time. May we sense your Spirit here. May we respond to each other with the kind of grace and hope that mirrors the triune nature that you hold. We give this time to you. Amen. So before we get into the new stuff from this week, I want to do two things. First, go over something that's going to happen again next month. Go over what we will and won't be doing with this webinar. It's incredibly important because it's very easy to make assumptions about the political positions that I may hold, or assumptions about the political positions of those who ask questions in the comments. So I'm going to start by doing my best to do a screen share. And it seems not to, oh, there we go, now it's working. Okay, so I'm going to have to wait a second on that because it's not working fully. So you're just going to have to stare at my face while I read off the wills and won'ts here. So first off, what we will and won't be doing. We will be pushing against partisan positions. I won't be promoting partisan positions. There's an important difference there. You will feel some pressure from the partisan positions or from any partisan positions that you may hold. And if you're a person who has political opinions, you may likely hold partisan opinions. But I won't be promoting the opposite. I will be explaining how Christians can agree on theology, but disagree on politics. I won't be minimizing the difficulty that is inherent in those differences. Our differences in this place are massive, and they cause a lot of complications for our churches. I will not be downplaying that in this webinar. I will help you be consistent and introspective about your political opinions. At least that's the goal. I won't be giving you ammunition to use against your political enemies. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times when we have conversations about politics in the church, we end up in these partisan fights without even recognizing it. And the conversations lead to just giving more ammo against particular enemies in the political world. I will be challenging you to consider and practice your politics differently, but I won't be arguing for abandoning the political world. Now, with those out of the way, I want to review a bit of what we did last month. It's going to be fairly quick because we have got a lot of content for this month's webinar, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page so that we can move forward as it's necessary to affirm the statements that were made at the last webinar in order to engage the conversation in this webinar. First, we reviewed an understanding of how Christian standards can align with government and recognized that they couldn't. We recognized that there was a distinct difference between the two, and that the means of Christ, which means the role of the church, the means of the church, is incompatible with the means of government. So the means of Christ are incompatible with the means of government. And what that means is that because Anabaptist Christianity is foundationally nonviolent, non-coercive, and Jesus-centered, government cannot participate in that. Government cannot be nonviolent, non-coercive, and Jesus-centered. Which leads to the second statement. All governments hold their authority exclusively through violence. There is no government system which exists in our world which does not rely on violence as its foundational support for that existence. And its final authority when things get down to the nitty-gritty of who gets to say what and when. To be honest, this has been played out recently in the recent political realm in our federal government as we enter into what many would call a constitutional crisis. And what that essentially means is who has the final authority to put who in jail. What that eventually means is who gets to say no, and then what do you do after they say no? What it always comes down to is where is violence allowed and who holds that sword? So all governments hold their authority exclusively through violence, which is antithetical to the means of the church, which is inherently nonviolent, Christ-centered, and as such, non-coercive. Now, before I move on, I want to pull that all together to say this. Here's the statement. We can't hold government to Christian standards because government has its own standards. Now we're going to answer the question of what standards can we hold them to in a second. But before we do, I noticed that we don't have any questions here right now, but if you were holding any questions in regards to those statements from the last webinar, now's your chance to get them out. So if you had any questions regarding the last webinar, feel free to try type in some of those in right now. I'm going to wait just a moment to see if anyone is interested in doing that, because we want to make sure we clarify those things now as opposed to later. I'm also attempting to get my screen share to work, so you're going to have to bear with me as I use this time. Excellent. I think I got that to work. Are you guys seeing, Michael, are you guys seeing my screen now? Assuming Michael might be in the same situation he was before of turning his mic off.
Yeah, yes, we can see him now.
Great. All right, so if all government, then we'll move on. So if all government gets its authority exclusively through violence, how are we supposed to be involved in government action? Our involvement in government must be focused on holding government to its God-ordained role. This is unique from the idea that many Christians tend to, from whether we're talking about mainline or more left-leaning Christians, or maybe more evangelical right-leaning Christians. This is quite different from how they tend to engage the government, which is to try and get it to reflect somehow a particular ethic of the Christian church. This is stating that there's a particular role the government has, which we are to hold them to, which may not align exactly with what the church's role is. Well, may not align at all with what the church's role is, not exactly, because of the fact that it's violent and we believe in a non-violent church, then there's no way that it can align. So our involvement must be to focus on holding the government to its God-ordained role. So I'm going to keep the screen share on for a second so that you can see just a bit of a few verses essentially on this matter. Now, I know if we wanted to, we could go into a deep Bible study on this, just over and over again, talking about all the details of each one of these areas. And that would take, well, a very long time. It would be worthwhile to do. And I encourage you to spend more time in these verses. Right now, we're going to read through 3 sections of scripture to get an image from the New Testament on what the government exists as, to start this conversation. So first, 1 Timothy 2, verse 2. Pray for kings and everyone who is in authority, so that we can live a quiet and peaceful life in complete godliness and dignity. So what does this statement, this verse in 1 Timothy tell us about the authority? We are to pray for kings and authority. Essentially, we are to pray for our governments, right? So that's what this says. But it has a very specific purpose for the prayer. It says we should pray for them so that we can live a quiet and peaceful life in complete godliness and dignity. One part of the role of government then is to create a situation in society to allow for this. So one piece of this is that government exists to allow for a quiet and peaceful life. All right. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 14. For the sake of the Lord, submit to every human institution. Do this, whether it means submitting to the emperor as supreme ruler, or to governors as those sent by the emperor. They are sent to punish those doing evil and praise those doing good. So now we're getting into far more complicated territory. If this doesn't make you uncomfortable yet, then you probably haven't been watching about what some governments can look like. Submitting to every human institution for the sake of the Lord is a big statement. In fact, this becomes complicated when we note the type of person who would be writing this. What happened to the apostles in the early church? What was their experience with what the government wanted to do to them? Well, let's keep going here. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. And I would assume that if you know much about Romans, you would expect that these verses would be coming up. Every person should place themselves under the authority of the government. There isn't any authority unless it comes from God. And the authorities that are there have been put in place by God. So anyone who opposes the authority is standing against what God has established. People who take this kind of stand will get punished. The authorities don't frighten people who are doing the right thing. Rather, they frighten people who are doing wrong. Would you rather not be afraid of authority? Do what's right, and you will receive its approval. It is God's servant, given for your benefit. But if you do what's wrong, be afraid, because it doesn't have weapons to enforce the law for nothing. It is God's servant put in place to carry out his punishment on those who do what is wrong. That is why it is necessary to place yourself under the government's authority, not only to avoid God's punishment, but also for the sake of your conscience. You should also pay taxes. Let me catch us up there, sorry. You should also pay taxes for the same reason, because the authorities are God's assistants concerned with this very thing. So pay everyone what you owe them, pay the taxes you owe, pay the duties you are charged, give respect to those you should respect, and honor those you should honor. So, how many of you are slightly terrified? My hope would be at least some. This sort of question, these verses are so often used in a way that I think has been damaging to people, that we get the knee-jerk internal response of rejecting the very idea of them. But I think that's because we probably haven't taken the time to think about what the situation is, even for the people who are writing this. Because it's true, we know that if we're not cautious around these verses, it can lead to some terrible, terrible outcomes. People who are not doing anything wrong end up in prison, or worse. And people who are doing something wrong may be elevated to all sorts of levels of authority in government. So how is it that verses like this can exist at the same time? I mean, think about what happened to Paul, the most prolific author of books in our New Testament here. What happens to Paul in this scenario? What happens to most of the apostles? What happens to the early church during the times under Diocletian and others when there's heavy persecution? When they submit to the authority of the emperor, as is stated here, they end up put in jail because they're servants of God. How can these verses work at the same time as the people who are doing the opposite? The author of Romans is saying, submit to the authorities, and the authorities don't want the author of Romans writing any of it. So how do we end up in a situation where an author can say, this is what we're supposed to do, submit to these authorities, while also themselves not submitting in the way that we might declare it today? What I would note is that it's important to look at this as not a declaration that all government is fulfilling its role at all times. The actual statements that are made here are about how government should be acting. These statements are about how we should be responding to the government while we call it to actually behave in the way it's supposed to. We see this throughout the New Testament. We see this throughout the early church, who would say, your persecution of us is unjust. One of my favorite quotes from the Christian Witness to the State is this: the state has never has a blanket authorization to use violence. The use of force must be limited to the police function, i.e., guided by fair judicial processes, subject to recognized legislative regulation, and safeguarded in practice against its running away with the situation. Only the absolute minimum violence is therefore in any way excusable. The state has no general authorization to use the sword independently of its commission to hold violence to a minimum. The definition then of what the government is called to do is to hold violence to a minimum. The best way, the shortest way, is probably to say government exists to limit evil. That's an important declaration. Government exists to limit evil. That word That word is the key part right there, limit. Government does not exist to eradicate evil. And it's a pretty logical explanation as to why that is. As we've already noted, government is inherently violent and coercive. Government can never be free from evil because its actions are such. All it can do is limit evil. It can never eradicate it at all as long as it's using violence and coercion to limit such evil. The only way that evil is truly eliminated is through the willing submission to Christ and the image of God's Holy Spirit moving in people. Government can only limit evil, not eradicate evil. Now, again, I noticed that we don't have any questions yet in the chat bar, but if you would like to, I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page here. If you want to throw something out there, I'd be happy to answer it.
Okay, do you see the question there, Scott?
Yeah. Okay. If we say that the government, good job, Brian. Brian, keep it up. Good questions like this are what we need to talk about. If we say that the government is supposed to punish those doing evil and praise those doing good, they would have to know what evil and good are, wouldn't they? But how can they know what good and evil are if they do not recognize Christ? Well, we can flat out say they cannot recognize, or a government institution can never recognize Christ in the sense of submitting to Christ. So a government organization can never do that. All they can do is, I don't want to get into probably the conversation of general revelation and specific revelation under Christ, but they have to lean heavily on the intuition of the human identity that is found under the knowledge that God gives to everyone. So I guess that falls straight under the category of general revelation. But that's where we'd have to lean on in this. And we recognize that that's going to be limited in different government structures. Under the authority of a Roman emperor, good, it would not be defined the way we understand contemporary good. Now, our role is to expose what is good and what is not, and to call government to reduce evil in that. But we have limited ability to do so as well. Our representation can't be one that forces that sort of morality on those who are not Christians. So what we want to do is, if we would go back, probably the best answer to this actually is if we go back to that 1 Timothy 2:2 passage, when it says, pray for kings and everyone who is in authority, so that we can live a quiet and peaceful life in godliness and dignity. That one of the core areas that we can help with this is to simply say, the more that people can live in godliness and dignity, which means that the allowance of a Christian responsive life, like essentially, obviously the persecution of Christians would not be a good, right? So that's the first one. That's part of what's happening in there, to say live in godliness, but also in dignity. It's recognizing that there is a basic human dignity that the government needs to uphold if they're going to fulfill their role. Awesome. Brian, I like this conversation. I can't keep it for just the two of us, but I am glad for these questions, Brian. I'll read this one again because it's a continuation of this. This language of two ethical standards, this is from Brian to everyone. This language of two ethical standards makes me uncomfortable. One standard for governments and the other for Christians, perhaps as humans, as individuals. This seems to set itself up for the dichotomies that have justified violence for most of Christendom. How can we avoid slipping into this kind of thinking? I cannot kill an enemy when I'm functioning as a Christian, but I can kill an enemy when I'm functioning as an agent of the state. Well, for one, I would argue that this does not give us any freedom to act as agents of the state who behave in a manner that Christians can't behave. I would argue strongly that, and we're going to have to get into this later, but I will touch it briefly now because it's so relevant, that just because government has the authority to act in evil ways doesn't mean we do. Certain behaviors of the state would be far beyond the pale of what a Christian can do. governments have the ability, and this is recognized in the statements here from Romans when it says, basically, do you think they have the power of the sword for nothing? Right? Just because they have the power of that sword doesn't mean that we are supposed to be taking up that sword, but it does mean that we have a role to limit where they use that sword. This is a very specific, well, that's a very specific conversation on our role with government, but it's a very important one to note that just because we're saying government has this role, the argument in Romans makes it clear that there is a difference between our call as the church who witnesses to a nonviolent kingdom and the role of government in a fallen world as a fallen power to respond. You might argue, and this gets into certain areas of theology that I don't think we want to go down too far, but you might argue this is an area of God's own self-condescension, that God condescends into our world in this way, to say in this scenario, God is seeking the limitation of evil through the use of a fallen people. And there's a whole long theological conversation to have on that about the whole Old Testament, and I think it's a worthwhile one. But I would say that specifically in the area of government, that's what we're seeing. This condescension of God into there to say that in a fallen world, Christians are not going to hold the authority, because as soon as we were to be at that level of authority, we'd be killed. So within that fallen system, how do you not allow the fallenness of it to collapse in on itself? It does set two standards in the sense that government can hold the sword and Christians cannot. But it allows our engagement in it, and we're going to get into that, to say our job is to limit that. All right. I like this question, Jane, but we're going to move on and probably come back to that idea in a bit. Jane wrote, what changes when the government says you are the government for the people, by the people, of the people? We're going to get to that in a minute, because the biggest change that it does is it gives us the most authority in human history to help show the government what it's supposed to be. So I'm not going to get too deep into that, except to say the early church had only basically one avenue to say you're not upholding your authority the way you're supposed to, which was give up their lives. They could stand in the way, but that was the most they tended to be able to do. We now have the ability to speak more directly to government when it is overstepping its authority. I think this one in particular, it's convoluted sometimes by noting that if we choose not to respond in certain ways, if we choose not to uphold certain ideas, that we are using our power in that sense, that we are using some power that we do hold. And I would push back to that to say that's a purely contemporary explanation for how power works in government. But that's already down a rabbit trail I should probably pull back from. So let's move forward. And I hope, Jane, if I don't fully get that question answered for you by the end of this, well, we'll come back. Feel free to let me know that you want to come back to it. So government has a role to limit evil, cannot eradicate evil. But this role is important, as we all know, in the sense that evil exists all around us. There's never been a time in human history where humans didn't do things that humans shouldn't be doing. We have a tendency to make a mess of things. Now, if government's doing its job, what it is doing is limiting the mess that is being made, but it is doing so with the force of evil. So I'm going to start sharing my screen again to give you guys another look at this. This is going to get really into the weeds of some political theory, and so I'm hoping to keep it, well, as tight as possible. Here we go. This before you is a baseball diamond, and baseball is the answer to all problems in life. No, it's not a baseball diamond, and I'm a Dodgers fan, so baseball can be very sad sometimes, actually. Anyway, this is actually what is referred to in political circles as a Nolan chart. Now, a Nolan chart is a way of organizing political identities and political theories so that we can understand how they relate to one another. A Nolan chart, if you've done any political science, Nolan charts are not perfect. And depending on what you put the criteria as along the Nolan chart, you will have, you'll have different outcomes. I'm going to use one of the most accepted ones because it's the easiest to see where different political groups are, but it is by no means perfect. So this Nolan chart is the economic and personal security and freedom description. So as you move up in the Nolan chart to the top, the very peak, you have the highest point of personal and economic freedom. And as you move down to the bottom of the Nolan chart, you would have the lowest point of economic freedom and personal freedom, but the highest points of economic security and personal security. Now, obviously, if you move left and right within this, you could get somewhere well, somewhere near the middle of this area. And that is where most people on the left and right of contemporary US politics exist. A good description of this is that at the top we have anarchy, right? Which is pure, politically you could argue some of these definitions, but it's basically pure economic and personal freedom to the limit of government. In this version, this description I'm giving you of anarchy, government does not exist. There is no governing authority, right? How governing would be done by individuals with individuals. So with no governing authority, you have ultimate economic freedom and personal freedom, but of course you have the cost of loss of security, both personal and economic. Now at the bottom, you have totalitarianism, which is essentially any form of government, for this definitional purpose, any form of government which holds all the power at all times, separated from the ability to express any kind of an economic or personal freedom. These images that we have in the New Testament of government really eliminate the top and bottom bars as being the role of government from a Christian perspective. So anarchy and totalitarianism are removed. There is no scenario of no government for people, at least not for a whole people. And then totalitarianism is completely removed as well, because it removes the ability, as we noted, for this idea of human dignity and godliness, the ability to freely act as we and worshiping God as we are called. So we end up with this branch in the middle, this chunk of possibilities, in which most Christians, very few find themselves in arguing for the top and bottom part anyway, but within which most Christians find themselves, on the left or the right in this Nolan chart. Now you would think perhaps that we got to this place purely based on our ethical ideas or our moral ideas of how government or how our neighbors or how even ourselves should act. You think that we would have our liberal or conservative views based on that. But the evidence is not so clear that that's the case. In fact, I would probably argue, along with most, I'm having a hard time getting to this here. I would argue that most political science would also argue at this moment that that's not how we produce our political ideas. So where you land on that Nolan chart is not necessarily a reflection of how you view morality. It might be something else entirely. I want to show you a book here. This is called The Righteous Mind. Oh, that's probably mirrored, so you can't read it. But The Righteous Mind, it's why good people are divided by politics and religion. I recommend, if you'd like to learn more about this, what I'm about to describe, that you take a look at this book. It's good for its purpose. In this book, Jonathan Haidt, he describes the idea that intuition of how the world should work is not universal. And that intuition is not universal even within communities in which you think it would be. But that intuition drives our moral frameworks, and then those moral frameworks drive our political identity. So we might end up in different places on that Nolan chart, even than the people who we're closest to. But at the same time, his book has struggled in the area of recognizing how people who are within a community are still more likely to align themselves with the political beliefs of that community. So let's take a look at how that could be. Well, I think the short answer to it is that we are just simply too quick to assume that our political positions are informed by our moral positions. This matters a lot in the situation right now, because the question earlier said, what level of, or how do these governments even know what evil is? Well, we tend to go back, I can't quickly switch to the Nolan chart, so I won't, but we tend to go to that chart and we argue that we stand at a moral position in here on the left or right within this range, and that is the moral reality for the government that they should be upholding. And we know it because we came at our spot on here from a moral thought, from a moral position. But that assumption is not necessarily holding up with more research. Currently, recently at least, in an article in, let's see, the American Journal of Political Science, which I'm sure everyone spends a lot of time reading, the American Journal of Political Science. But recently, there's an article titled "Ideology Justifies Morality. Political Beliefs Predict Moral Foundations." And in this article, I find it absolutely fascinating. In this article, we find that the researchers went through giving morality tests and asking questions of political party affiliation. Now, the morality tests are not to test the morality of the people who are taking the test. The morality test is simply asking them, it's a questionnaire to say, what do you believe? What do you believe is moral? Well, it turns out that they were unable, with all of the data they pulled together, they were unable to actually predict a political party affiliation based on the moral statements that are made. But they were able to figure out what your moral statements would be if you first told them what your political party was. Now, I do recommend you read the actual article itself. You can look that up. Like I said, it's titled "Ideology Justifies Morality. Political Beliefs Predict Moral Foundations" in the American Journal of Political Science. It's got a lot of numbers. They put a lot of data points into this to show how it worked. But it turns out a lot of us end up finding our spot of government morality on that Nolan chart, not based on our moral predispositions. Instead, we find our spot and then we build our morality based on that. Now, this doesn't mean that directly says what our Christian ethics are. That's actually slightly different, but what it does say is that we justify our political positions far more often than we think we do by acting like they were formed by our morality, as opposed to the opposite. Meaning, we tend to say government should do it because it's moral, when what we're actually being formed by is we think this is what government should do because this is our party's perspective, and I mean that in the widest sense possible, our political tribe. This is what our political tribe says, and therefore it's moral. That complicates matters when Christians start saying, so how do we hold the government to the least evil they can do? Because we just simply don't agree on what that is. When you look at that Nolan chart, we put different pinpoints in, and then when we start to discuss, well, what is the least evil that government can do to withhold or to hold back evil? We start disagreeing in ways we never thought we would. But let me give you I know some of that might feel a little complicated. I'm going to give you the cleanest way to explain that I've been able to find so far. All right. Call it the evil continuums. Now, the evil continuums are one of the places then, based on the Nolan chart, based on our political and, tribal affiliations, the evil continuums are the places of disagreement at its deepest level. The first evil continuum you can look at here is the scale of natural evil. Natural evil, I'm only using that term to say basically it's evil that exists without the government intervening. Like without the government, people are just going to do some bad stuff. And this is a chart to show that. Now, if I were to give this thing a label, particularly a political label, if I were to label that abortion, if I were to label that homelessness, if I were to give this thing a label, we would already have disagreements. We would already have disagreements on what level that natural evil is at. So hold on to that, knowing that two things are happening here. One, we have contemporary worldview issues, meaning just what the zeitgeist of society is. We have that determining what it is. We also have our political parties determining what it is. And then we have the inkling that we're supposed to attach the statements of Christ to Christ's followers into here, and that starts to determine what this level of evil is. So these are all weighing on what we would call natural evil. Next, we have government evil. As we noted, government can only act in evil ways to limit the evil or the natural evil of the world. So government evil is another place. Now that we've added that into the equation, this is another place in which we could disagree wildly. When we start getting into the area of government evil, this is where I am most convinced that Christians speak right past each other, because we don't recognize the difference in the base difference in where we're setting ourselves up on the Nolan chart. So when we get to the issue of government evil, we just assume everyone has the same idea on how evil something is when government does it. And that's just flatly not true. Depending on where you find yourself on that Nolan chart, you will find certain government actions to be more evil than others. The lower you get on the Nolan chart, for one, you will simply have the belief that that more government intervention is more justified, because you simply find that to be politically true. Whereas if you're higher up on it, the more government intervention, it's automatically more evil. Now, if this works out, regardless, so we already have variance on the two continuums, but regardless, if these two come together in the way that I have described here about government evil limiting natural evil, something like this should be the outcome, right? So government evil is there, and in fact, government evil doesn't dissipate between the two, because it's by the government evil, it actually is what decreases the natural evil. But if it works out the way it's supposed to, that's what we get. Basically, you will have, if you brought this scale without defining the specifics of what you're saying the level of natural evil is, or the level of government evil, if you're not too specific and you just gave this to the average person to say government's role is always going to include, even if you removed evil and said violence or something, but its goal is to limit the evil that we find around us. Most people would affirm that this is a good thing, that government behaving in this way is a good way. Like, this is the best form of government. It uses the least amount of evil to produce the greatest effect. But of course, we don't all agree on this. And we all know that this isn't always the case. Let me give you another version. What happens when it starts to shift and we see this instead? So now we have government evil that's really high. And that use of evil is limiting the evil of the natural world, but it's doing so at such a level that it adds more evil to the world around it. Now, this is one of the things that should be rejected. In fact, you could argue this is one version of a totalitarian government that exerts high authority over its citizens in such a way that all of their life is kept from any kind of violent expression, and crime is really low. Let's just go simply with that. Crime is incredibly low, but everyone's scared because they're always under the threat of violence by the government, right? So in that scenario, yes, you've limited the natural evil, but the government has exerted so much evil that it outweighs the good of it. Now, this one, again, most people would look at this, and as long as you didn't overly define what the natural evil or government evil is, as long as you said, if it were true that this were the situation, most people would argue this is bad. Going to the next one. This is also a bad one that people would recognize. In this scenario, it's incredibly effective, right? We've got an image of incredibly effective government evil at eradicating natural evil. But it still adds to it because government evil can't be reduced. Now, again, this one is even more dramatic than the other one to say there's less evil that it's responding to. But government evil is already so high that the evil it's using to suppress the other evil, to suppress the natural evil, is already unacceptable. So in the middle graph, we have an image of government evil, which is still less than the natural evil it's trying to hold back. But in this last graph, we have the image of government evil being so high that it's already past the natural evil it's suppressing. Now, I originally, multiple times now that I've given this talk, I've given examples of how these can play out. And I've got them. But for the most part, it makes government sound like it's always doing terrible things. And I don't think that's the case. A lot of what government does is good. Historically, we know this. We know that they've used evil to do some wonderful things. Weird statement, I know. they've used evil to do some wonderful things for the experience of people to live godly lives in peace. But there are versions of it that we need to recognize. These three in particular are ones that I could give you examples of, but I think really matter in the conversation. So we have the exertion of evil, which is incredibly strong, like a previous chart. The exertion of evil from the government, which is extremely strong and reduces the overall evil, but by to what cost? At what cost? So that's the first one. The second one is really interesting because in this one, we have the image of a natural evil that's not that high and government intervention that's not that high either. But somehow the government intervening actually exacerbates a problem. And so you end up with more evil, both natural and of course the government evil. And the last one is probably the most fascinating for me because this conversation is the one that I think bogs us down the most, is areas that we might just flat out disagree on are all that naturally evil to begin with. And government evil then intervenes. But again, at what cost? Government evil intervening produces no better result. It reduces the evil that's around it, but it barely makes an impact. And in the end result is, of course, more evil. Now, this scenario, oh, wonderful. Thank you, Michael, for putting that up there. This scenario, which says that the evil that exists in the world needs to be combated with government evil, but recognize that we have different variations of how we expect that evil to play out, meaning natural. One person might say that a particular experience of natural evil in the world is up here, and others would say it's down here. And then, of course, depending on your view of the role of government, you'd say that the government evil action is way up here, and others would say it's way down here. These differences mean that when we speak to fellow Christians about something that we think is wrong with the world, that the government should do something about, we are automatically assuming they agree with us on what our continuum is. And we don't have a conversation necessarily about fixing that continuum, in part because we don't recognize often that the baseline view of government might be completely different. Meaning their pure understanding of government action might be viewed as more evil than ours or less evil than ours. And until we at least recognize that that's a reality in the world that when we're dealing with fellow Christians, then what we end up doing is merely pointing fingers at them saying, like, you don't love your neighbor. When in reality, what they're saying is your understanding of how government interacts here is flatly different. Now, we could argue that we can probably just bend each other toward our view on this, but it's highly unlikely. In many ways, these conversations end up in a stalemate of people agreeing not to talk about them anymore. So how do we have conversations that move beyond that sort of stalemate, that constant battling with one another over what is the more moral option here? Well, before we answer that, I want to give an opportunity for anyone to ask some questions about, particularly about those continuums, to say what's happening there, and well, if there's any misunderstanding or concerns about that. This is an area that I get the most pushback on because there tends to be some confusion about rating those. So if you'd like to throw something out there. So there is the question, this is part of the previous conversation on, well, part of this conversation on ideology justifies morality. How would the ideology justifies morality theory make sense of people who decide to change political parties? On what basis can they decide to do that if your political allegiance is foundational? Well, the moral theory of kind of the moral foundations theory is what it's called. I'm pretty certain. The moral foundations theory, which is something that that Jonathan Haidt and others would suggest is the basis for our political ideas. They would argue that basically it's a conversation of our moral transitions that then fades into the political world, right? So we've simply shifted our moral positions, and therefore we start changing our political identities as such. if you affirm that as the pure answer, I think that there's probably something to the moral foundations theory, but there's too much evidence coming out of this ideology justifying morality piece to say that that's not likely the case. Most of the time, I would say that if ideology justifies morality is a true theory, that what we find is experiential transitions more than ideological transitions are what happens. So what happens is your tribe shifts. Right? That's actually the argument here, is that it's not that your political identity shifts based on your morality, but your tribe that you identify in shifts, and their political identity starts to weigh on you. I mean, you've probably known people who went to like university, or they went to seminary, or they moved to a new area, and that eventually their political identity shifted. Some of this is what we're talking about. So the tribe, the people that you most identify with, changes, and as such, some of your morality, your political morality, changes as well. We know this because, according to this sort of theory, the argument is not that your political beliefs are going to identify your morality. This is really important. Not that your specific political beliefs will identify your morality, but the tribe of your politics will identify it. Meaning it's actually the community by which you identify with that dictates it in that scenario, not the specific political theories. So this is why I would argue that in this scenario, it's more like even Democrat, Republican, or liberal, conservative. And if you identify with those names, if that tribe starts to change its perspective, you change with it. It has its biggest weight in our own political realities. If you look around, you'll notice that a lot of people who used to say certain ideas were opposed to their political views have stayed in their political camps, but would now argue that their political leaders can do different things. Even though they used to condemn those things, they will now say it's perfectly fine. You'll find this even recently. I hate to bring in politicians' names because it always makes people assume that they think that they know my political opinions. But I did bring this up even when I talked about this in a sermon here at our church, is that you can go into areas of politics in which even recently certain things happening in an administration now that people are upset by were being done in the previous administration, but those people didn't bat an eye. And I've heard the argument, well, we trusted that person. Sure, that's an excuse, really. What it comes down to is that was your tribe. And this is how it's proven in this, well, I don't want to say proven, that's too far for a study like this, but it's shown to be an actual phenomenon in this, that our tribe tends to dictate it. I don't even want to use this to say that that's entirely somehow wrong. This is a human condition. Our tribes do this. The question is, as Christians, how do we recognize that as being true, and then stop going around and pointing at other people and saying, that's what you do, but not me. That's what you do, but I don't do that. Everyone else who I don't agree with might do that, but not me. How do we instead look at it and say, if there are a range of possible Christian options, how do we weigh this carefully using those evil continuums to have a conversation about how much evil we're willing to put out, or we're willing to put up with, I guess, by the government to limit the evil around us? I will give you a couple examples of this just because I think it matters a lot. One of the earliest examples I gave of this is that if you go to Japan, it has one of the lowest crime rates in the world and one of the highest conviction rates at the same time. One of the lowest murder rates you've ever seen. But if you are arrested for murder, the conviction rate is 99%. You also get 89% of the people who are convicted did so with full confessions. But they can also keep you in prison for like a month with limited contact with an attorney in a very difficult situation, and actually during that entire time interrogate you. Now, I'm not arguing that there's a lot more. Every time I bring that up, people like to tell me all the things culturally in Japan that are happening. There's a lot more going on there. But I do want to express that that's an image of that evil continuum that says we could have conversations about what would it mean to eliminate all sorts of evil in our world, even corruption in government. But what do we want to put in place to stop it, because we're always going to have to put a government response in place, meaning a communal authority of violence. It's probably the best definition I can give for what a government is, which is a communal authority of violence. And we have to all agree that we're willing to put that in place to be a response to it. So yeah, every time we have this conversation, we need to recognize that's what we're doing. In fact, I think that's probably our biggest flaw when we do this. When we talk about government evil out there, we almost always assume that other people are more willing and more accepting of evil than we are, if they're our political opponent. We assume that the person who is out there who has a different opinion than us in some way is more accepting of evil, either in the natural evil or the government evil than we do. And I think that that's really a matter of personal observation. We just don't spend, I recognize this in myself. We just don't spend as much time personally evaluating the evil we're willing to put up with in government, because we just assume we're right. And I get it, because we have to. We talked about this in the first webinar. We have to assume we're right, because if you weren't right, you wouldn't hold the political opinion you hold. You'd change it. So we have to assume we're right, but we don't have to do so without interrogating ourselves to say, what sort of evil am I willing to put up with, particularly to respond to the evil outside there? And we don't have to look at the people around us and assume they themselves are just willing to put up with more evil. We should probably instead start. If we're going to bridge this divide, we have to at least start by assuming the people around us are using slightly different guides. And those guides might not be something that they have full control over even. This is a bit of what the conversation is regarding this political kind of tribal identity, to guide whether or not a particular government action is more evil or a natural evil is more. I could give a couple more on that, but I want to answer this question from Trinity first. What is our role as Christians in opposing evil done by our government, or in reducing the amount of evil done by the government? Isn't the question how much evil we will engage in to reduce greater evil by the government? Is the decision of how much evil we engage in personal to each of us based on our own understanding? Yes. One short answer, I think I'm answering this right. In reducing the evil of government. So our role is specifically to engage government, and we're going to get into more specific action steps. I don't want to say that because you're going to assume it's different than what I'm going to go over. We're going to get into how you can think about action steps in the next webinar. But this does say that what we have to do is go for an actual response out in the world, out in the government, to hold it accountable. And it will be personal, but it should also be done communally. Now, I don't necessarily mean that community action is the role, like the whole church should try and unite around it, because generally speaking, that makes a totally different statement. That makes a statement of kingdom ethics that I think is a bit dangerous, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't. I just think we should be really cautious about it. But I do think we should, before we engage government, talk to our fellow Christians around this, especially those who disagree with us, so that when we're responding to the evil of government, that we think government is doing something wrong, that when we respond, we're doing so recognizing why other people might disagree, so that we can respond well, for one, and so that we can look at the log in our own eye. Like, make sure that what we're seeing is as accurate as we can. There's no way to get it perfect, because government is going to do evil. But there is a way that we can look at how other people are seeing it in such a way that we can hopefully see more of what's possible. And at bare minimum, like, if all you get from this is to stop immediately hating people who disagree with you in politics, I would count it as a win. Because if you're a leader in the church, which many of you are, you've seen how many Christians, I mean, they would never use the word because they're good Christians, but they basically hate their political rivals. And at bare minimum, if all you get from this is the recognition that we are making too many assumptions about how people are seeing evil in the world, then that's a benefit. That itself is a benefit. Okay, so Brian asks the question, but doesn't all of this discussion of how much evil we were willing to put up with inherently put us in a power over posture. Isn't engaging the government a matter of mobilizing our power to try to coerce the government to do what we think is right? So coercion requires a threat of violence, right? So this is not coercion. Engaging is not necessarily coercion. It is leveraging the response of the community. But I do think we need to be wise about what that looks like and real careful about what the outcome is. Let me put it this way. When it comes to this conversation of our political involvement, too many of us basically look at the government and say, if it isn't exactly the way I want it, it's wrong. But then we also say, we want participation of a larger community in government. I mean, one of the things that I'm always shocked by is the way that people who are Christians who want to hold the government accountable also want people to vote. And then they get mad if they didn't get the election result they wanted. Like, they asked real living people to put their opinions out there. And when it turns out the opinions of those real living people weren't what they wanted, they get upset. One of the things we have to recognize is that if we're going to get on the same page with the community and say we have to hold government accountable and walk with people, even people who don't disagree with us in doing that, it's totally personal, recognizing that non-Christians around me won't necessarily have the same idea of what government should be. So when I go to hold the government accountable, if part of my belief is that the best way we do that is through some sort of democratic process, I have to be willing to say that that is a value in and of itself. It would be really interesting. Let me put it in this way. It would be really interesting if Christians started responding differently to political losses, recognizing that they affirmed a particular process when they joined it. Now, this is going to come up in the next webinar, so I'm going to tread here lightly, but in order for this to not be power over, we must have systems of government which allow our participation in, right? Where other people also, I mean, this is why we have a more democratic government, why I would affirm that it's one of the best versions of it would be a democratic republic, but I'm willing to concede that I don't have the ultimate answer there. But in doing so, we're not doing power over, but at the same time, we're releasing the finality of our opinion. Meaning, Christians, if you go out and vote and you affirm, let's put it this way, when you get into a church, everyone gets together. No, I'm not going to use the church model. Let's just say that your community is 25 people, and all 25 of you walk into a room, and you all agree, shaking hands, saying, here's what we're going to do. We're going to vote, and we're going to use a simple majority wins here. Everyone good with that? Great. So we're going to vote on who's going to lead our group of 25 people. And the end result is 15 people voted for one person and 10 voted for the other. And now the 10 are really upset because their person didn't win. But you agreed from the beginning that whoever got the most was going to win. How about in the same scenario where someone comes in there and out of those 25, one person walks off and says, you know what? I find this system of choosing a leader to be too evil. Like this whole system is a problem. And you guys are in a cycle of violence that isn't going to get me better. So I'm out. So now we have 14 wins over here and 10 over here and one person on the outside. Now, I'm not arguing for not voting in a government election. That would not be my argument. But I am arguing that that person on the outside is at least looking at them and saying, you all agreed that whoever gets the most should win. And you'd never be upset if it was your guy or girl. If it was your person who won, you wouldn't be upset. You'd be thrilled. You're only upset because you didn't win, even though you agreed to the process. And this guy on the outside saying that process might be evil. So this is why I want to describe this in particular as I know it's kind of a long-winded way to talk about Brian's question, but it's not power over when what we're saying is we want to respond within the community, within the people, and we want to do so in a way that we think balances this evil continuum as best we can. And sometimes it might say the whole thing you've got going on is unacceptable, because we shouldn't accept the lesser evil. Never. We are the people following the way of Christ. The lesser evil should not be the thing we're shooting for. We should be shooting for the least evil. When we look at these continuums together, of the natural evil and the government evil, stop siding with your party. I don't care what party it is. Don't just assume that the party position is less evil or is the least evil. Even if you're right that it's a lesser evil, it might not be the least evil. And we as Christians need to be looking at those continuums, not our identity. I am concerned that the ideology justifying morality theory has real influence in, like, it's a real problem. But I would go and argue that the ideology that should justify our morality is our Christian ideology. And I think most people in the church find their identity more on the Nolan chart than they do on the cross. And I think if we found our identity primarily on the cross, then we would look to those conversations of the natural evil and the political evil very differently. And we would not look for the answers of our political parties. We would not find our primary identity within that, but be able to speak to one another, recognizing that we may have differences, but that we have a commonality, a touchstone on Christ here to stand on when we make political conversations a reality in our world. I think that the most important thing we can do coming out of this when we look at each other is to call each other to that. If you want to take action with people who disagree with you and you want to start a political conversation within your church, and this again is touching a bit on the next webinar, but if you want to start the political conversation in your church, make sure the first thing you're trying to do is get people aligned with Christ, not your political ideas. In fact, I would argue that the biggest problem we got around this, the biggest one, even bigger than the other ones I probably said were the biggest ones, is that we are oftentimes more interested in evangelizing for our parties or our political positions, at least, than we are for actually convincing people to faithfully follow Jesus. I have seen in our churches people who are far more interested in their church being mobilized for political ideas than mobilized for following Christ faithfully. Now, I'm not arguing that following Christ faithfully means they shouldn't be mobilized for political ideas. But what I am saying is that their energy is primarily toward convincing people of political ideology, and way before or beyond any kind of imagery of submitting to Christ. And I don't think we're going to do this right if we do it in that way. I think as soon as we accept that the political ideologies of our Nolan chart are the end-all be-all of our conversations, then we've lost. We've given up the authority that actually that is outside of this political cycle. Christianity is at its heart a political party. It is the statement that Jesus Christ is Lord. That is a political statement. And if we can't declare that truly and fully, willing to lay everything else down first, then I hope they're not always arguments, but then our conversations about the evil continuum, our conversations about the way government can go forward, will end up on the altar of the false god of a political ideology. And I think we've sacrificed enough of our relationships and enough of our churches to that altar. I think it's time to stop and look at the cross as the image of what we're supposed to be doing. All right. Well, you got me a little bit into a sermon, but I'm a pastor, so and you're somewhat captive to me. Sorry. But I do want to respond to a little bit more here. This entire section here is primarily about engaging the questions that you have, this last section, so I want to give another chance to it. Let's see. Is it possible we're overemphasizing the violence of government when the text presented tonight show a flip side in which government is also to praise the good and promote peace? Would you say that the only way the government can praise good and promote peace is found in violence? No, I wouldn't say that. That's worth noting. Government can only be an authority to praise good and promote peace by using violence, but I wouldn't say that it has to use violence to praise good and promote peace. Oh man, that's tricky. Now that I said it out loud, I think I'm wrong. I think I would argue that every government action stems from the possibility of the government using violence, and for the smallest ones, basically government doesn't get money without coercion. So it's impossible for it to pretty much do anything in that way. Or the bare minimum, it gets it from the authority of being an authority, meaning it can't, and this is what I was saying at first, it can't promote peace as an authority without showing its authority with its use of violence, meaning it has to be able to use the violence to promote the peace. Now, that being said, I think government can do that, and they can do that that's probably one of the lowest levels of violence it can do, is to actively promote peace as opposed to using direct violence in that way. And so that's probably the least violent, the least evil it could do, is to actively promote peace. And I think that, the closest you're going to get to hearing my political perspective is that I think the government should be trying to do that. I think all government should be trying to do that at the highest level possible, always, because that's the best way, I would imagine, to eliminate or to reduce evil. Oh, Michael threw out a great question. In your view, what is or are Jesus' tactics for community transformation or re-shaloming the world? And yes, Michael, that is next week. But the teaser on that is that Jesus is primarily looking to create an alternative community for the world to look at, but that alternative community can re-shalom the world in the sense of, well, nope, that's it. That's all I'm saying. They can re-shalom the world. You want to hear more? That's the next webinar next month. Not next week, Michael, but next month. Yeah. Brian asked, this may be getting ahead, but I do have a practical question about having political conversations at our churches. It seems like we have to adopt the moral language that governments recognize in order to call upon the government to do what is right. By using that language, we risk falling into the ideology justifies morality tendency ourselves, which is actually a pretty compelling explanation about how we got this partisan gridlock within the Mennonite church. I think you're right, Brian. But so how can we engage government using this language without being overly influenced by it ourselves? Yeah, and I am going to go over that at the next webinar. But this is not a small thing. When I almost treat it too flippantly when I'm almost preach to you all about how we can push back at this. You're talking about the biggest Goliath that humans can create. The reason why politics are so powerful and so difficult of a conversation in the church is because they're so easily justifiable, right? Like, the reason they're so hard is because they are so justifiable. Our political identities are so easily justified by using particular language within the political world, as well as is kind of baptizing it with our Christian language. I would argue that political ideology is the Goliath that the church has to face if we're going to engage politics in any way. In fact, I would argue if we're not willing to be on the assault when it comes to political ideology, in removing that from our core identity, if we're not willing to, then we probably should back out of politics, because it's too tempting. It's the largest temptation anywhere, because it offers you two things. It offers you an image that says you can change the world. This is the offer that Satan gave Jesus, and we talked about that in the first webinar. Like, that is the temptation. You can change the world. Just bend your knee to this ideology. And secondly, it's the temptation of community that seems transformative. And I would argue that's a really big deal in churches today, because a lot of churches don't feel like they experience real transformation. Now, you could argue about that as a personal transformation or communal transformations, but you get a real concrete transformation when you leverage violence against people, when you leverage coercion. Let's use that language for it. When you leverage coercion against people, you get immediate results, and you can create real good with it. I'm just not going to argue that against that. And I talked about that in the first webinar. We can create real good by leveraging the government. And so when you can create real good, and you can find a tribe that is like-minded, that doesn't want to fight you, that's a massive temptation. That's a massive one. And instead, I want to say, if we're going to get involved at all, we have to be constantly aware of this. We just have to be vigilant at the highest level of the temptation to find our identity there. And I would just say that's it. the biggest issue in that specific area is the temptation of what political ideology offers. Is like it's the image of the accuser with Jesus. Is I'm going to give this all to you, and it can be given, but at what cost? And so yeah, I'd argue if we're going to step into that realm at all, it must be done with constant vigilance and awareness. So I actually, if any specific church were to say, Scott, what can we do? Like right here in our church, not just as a general rule to everyone, but like if they invited me, let's say, Brian, you invited me right over to wherever your church is. I'm not sure where you're at. Maybe you're Ohio. Okay, I'll just assume that. You invite me right in there, and I walk in the door, and you say, okay, Scott, how do we do it right here? I'd say, first off, start praying that you don't fall into the temptation to feel like you're right. Because that's the first step of ideological damage. That we somehow have created something that is not our political identities, that have no evil in them, that our political identities are the righteous ones, that our political identities are it's just so prevalent at all times. And again, that's touching to the next webinar, but that humility it's not a good thing, it's the mandatory thing. The actual humility to say every good thing we've done politically also included evil, and to say that truly and admit it. See, I have a sticker in my car. I know we need to wrap up, but I have a sticker in my car, and for many people it's a very confusing sticker, because if they've spent enough time talking to me about politics, it looks to be different than they would expect. I've got an I voted sticker on next to the radio on my car. It's got the little stars and stripes on it. And yeah, it says I voted, and it's worn out now. It's been there for quite a while. And I think people see that as like they want to find out, well, who did you vote for? And like, what are you saying with it? Is it I'm a winner, or is it like I'm part of the resistance, or is it like I voted in a local election for teachers' pay? Like that was a big issue here. It's a really big deal in our local community. Like I voted on this issue, or I voted on that issue. What are you trying to say with it? And what I'm trying to say is I need to remember that I was probably wrong. Like for me, I look at that, and that sticker is a reminder to repent. It's a reminder to say, like, I participated in something that there's no way I didn't create more evil in it. Now, I could have, if I'm lucky, and if I did my due diligence, and if I participated in the way I'm calling out here, I participated in reducing the evil of the world because our government allows us to participate in that way, and we can hold them accountable. But I might not have. And even if I did, I still participated in the type of evil that I think God is going to, that God calls us to something further in, and the kingdom of God is not found in it. And so it's a statement of repentance. It's a statement for myself to remember not to find my identity in it. So if you ever happen to get into my car with me, you can have a good conversation about the I voted sticker that's sitting there. But yeah, that matters to me, and I think that this is the question. Man, this area. Well, of course it is. I'm doing the webinar. This is the stuff of our modern church, and where we are most likely to bend the knee to government is not going to be, I don't think, in a particular type of persecution. It's going to be in a particular type of perceived righteousness of our particular moral government. And so we need to, particularly as Anabaptist Christians, stand and declare that that's never the case. Some governments are better than others, but no government is good. All right, well, that's all old news. I am thankful you guys participated this week. I really, really love this conversation and the questions. You guys have some great ideas. I'm excited that Michael threw up those references to the article and the book. Check those out. Have fun with the article. If you read that article, you need to let me know, because that article that's work, and that's a political science work. So if you read the actual journal article, that's a big deal to me. You could also, it's worth noting, you can look it up. I think there have been reviews on it. I know there's one in the Atlantic, and if you just type in the title of it, you'll get multiple places where it's been talked about in journals and other newspapers, so you can get reviews of it or summaries, which will help you understand it. It's worthwhile knowing the tension of the moral identity theory, and then moral foundations theory, as well as the identity justifying morality theory. Those things matter a lot for trying to understand the contemporary political climate. I think I'll give that to Michael. We can't hear you, but
Yeah,
I
I
think
don't know if I'm closing or if Shanna is. I noticed her video's up, but thank you, Scott, so much for the time, for diving into this topic. Feel free to email Scott through the week if you have questions, things like that. You can also get them through Shanna or me to him. Actually, Shanna and I will be with Scott at the CLC meeting that they're graciously hosting for Mennonite Church USA the next number of days. So thank you again, Scott, for this, and looking forward to the third installment. And thank you for all of you that are present in the webinar, and look forward to wrapping this up, where you're going to solve all these tensions, right, Scott, with a nice bow.
All of it. It'll be perfect and clean. I'll even tell you who to vote for at the next national election.
That's right.
No, I won't. I didn't even joke about it. I definitely won't.
I'm joking too, by the way. That's so.
All right, thank you all. The recording of this webinar will be available at thegatheringplace.us in about a week or so. And we will see you all on Tuesday, November 19th, the same time. Everyone who registered for this webinar will get an invitation to the next one automatically. You don't have to re-register for the November webinar. Thanks for joining us. We will see you in November. Good night.